you, Maggie. Thank you. I speak quite often for organisations and this sort of thing. I've got to honestly say that to follow that is an absolute honour, and I would like to point out how humbled I am actually, having just hung around OYF the last few days. It's quite an extraordinary organisation, and we're going to be talking about extraordinary organisations and how we can identify what they look like and what we can do to build ourselves an amazing organisation. And I think we're probably already engaged in one that's showing many of the skills and behaviours that are going to make for absolute top performance. And if I ever needed proof of that, I just saw it in the last 10 minutes or so. So I don't bring to you anything more than some ideas and thoughts. We tend to work in a more thematic idea of where you get great teams and high-performing organisations, and sometimes to be outside it and looking in is quite an advantageous and, let's be honest, in some respects, an easier place to do it from. However, what we then would seek to do is move that into your reality and your teams and your organisations and your situations, because that's where the value is for you. So what we'll try and do as we go through this presentation is work through some of the ideas that will seek to maximise the performance of our teams, get ourselves as an organisation, if you like, whether it's large or small, to absolutely optimise the talents that it has, but also then to apply that in a really meaningful and practical way. And although I don't know all your realities individually, nobody knows that better than you, is to give you some, hopefully, thoughts and opportunities to think about how we can move some of those ideas forward. So what we'll be looking at as we run through this afternoon, we'll start with understanding the sort of role of leadership in building high-performing teams. Many of us are in positions where we are at the forefront of what we produce within our organisation. Some of us are contributing to that production within another or a larger group. Well, that actually doesn't make a great deal of difference. One of the things we'll be talking about a lot today is the idea of leading at all levels and that optimisation of people's capabilities at every level. And that's really when we focused into what a high-performing team can give you. That's really where we're going. Understanding what makes that high-performing team. It can take on any challenge, and you certainly within your sector, agriculture is something that where there's so many different challenges from so many different directions, some of which are totally beyond your control, others you would wish to control but can't, others you can hold some kind of agency with. And understanding how we can move some of those things forward will be also there. Understanding how clarity, culture and interdependence. These are the three pillars that we'll be talking about as we go through that. That clarity of understanding, that strong culture that supports that, but then the capability and the willingness to act interdependently and within your team. And then one of the factors we'll really be going into really is who is in your team and where are the strengths and where are the challenges and what can we do to maximise those strengths and how can we minimise some of the more negative impacts that come from places that we wouldn't necessarily wish to be.
And we know that you've spent a lot of this last week thinking about resilience and how one builds resilience. And one of the things we want to kind of highlight through this is one of the very reasons you build high-performing teams is that actually it lowers your need for resilience. Because if you can work together and reduce your stress by having the right supportive environment and being really clear about your strategic aims, then you're far less likely to run into those difficulties that turn pressure into stress and therefore require high levels of resilience. I'll just stay here.
But we'll just take a moment. And the reason why I was keen to take a moment is I've been watching the nominees and they've been at a very high octane rate for the last few days. And I am in admiration of you. You have certainly, the world is moving fast for you right now. And no doubt many of us get caught up in what's happening right now. So just have a read through what Edward Bear thinks about that. So why do I put that up? Why do I show that? I use it actually quite often. It's quite an interesting insight. Why would I use it? It's about the tyranny of the urgent. It's about everything that's going on for most of us is that factor that is bumping in to us and compelling us to do things. And very often it's a short time span, short event horizon, and we have got to react. And it prevents us being able to sit back, step away from that, and just think a little bit more broadly, a little bit more strategically about what's going on right now. And that idea of consistently bumping our heads is something I see in so many organisations that are reacting. And what we want to be able to do is get ourselves into a position where we can respond when we can, with that view, with that idea, with the bigger things in mind. So what I'm going to ask you to do is just sit back, look at your organisation, think about where you are in your reality, and we're just going to try and spend a little bit of time to shine a light into a few areas that hopefully will help us stop bumping our heads for a minute and be able to step back and think more broadly. So when we look at organisations, and we work all over the world in very many sectors. We've done quite a lot of work in agriculture as well. And what we find is that there are some sort of basic things that each and every organisation has in order to really be an effective organisation. Oh, that'd be nice if that happened. Good. And those are those sorts of ideas, those dimensions that you have that make up an organisation. Things like leadership, things like strategic planning, things like management processes, things like improving and being sustainable, and those sorts of thoughts and ideas. Well, if you take all of those things and clump them together, that's what an organisation is doing to a greater or lesser extent. Where we're going to concentrate today is looking a little bit at leadership in particular and some of the cultures and values, and maybe be able to think a little bit more strategically about how we can put some of those in place, because those really underpin many of the other factors that we see across that list. And when we see how you see the growing of an organisation as it moves towards maturity and it moves towards optimisation, if you like, it moves through those sorts of ideas of being ad hoc and static and then being a very reactive organisation to being more structured, more proactive, understanding where it sits, beginning to understand where it's going, focusing its efforts, aligning what it does effectively, and then moving into that idea of continuous improvement. And it doesn't matter whether you're a large organisation or a small organisation. It doesn't matter which sector you're in. It doesn't matter if you're a not-for-profit. If you can move through and get to the point where you are able to be continuously improving your organisation, then you truly understand where you are and where you're trying to get to. Because that idea, if you like, of continuous improvement, working through that cycle, desire to improve or change, moving into the ability to investigate what it is you want to do, explore what we can do to understand that more effectively, design those interventions, put them in place, and then implement that change. And it's not a case of what are we going to do procedurally, it's how do we implement that change in the way we behave and the things we do and the way we make decisions, the way we see ourselves and the way we see ourselves fitting into what we do as an organisation. When that goes in, and that starts to happen very much at the people level, and we deal with people when we talk about organisations. We are how they fit into making that effective. We then evaluate that performance, we see what it's doing, and then we go all the way back around the cycle again, because that's that continuous improvement idea. Identify it, understand it, implement it, review it. Round and round.
So what we're going to do today is take a little bit of time to see what kind of processes, we're looking at the process, but what elements do we need to put in place to actually make this happen? How do we bring people along with us in this kind of continuous improvement change?
Which leads us back to that sort of three-legged stool we were talking about when we talk about high-performing teams. High-performing teams being made up of having a high level of capability in those three core areas. They have absolute clarity. They have a clear vision, a mission of where they're going. Their goals are articulated and they're understood across the organisation. They then have a culture, and the culture that's supportive, it's communicative. It's like we're all in this together, and whatever it comes at us, we are able to overcome it. We're able to thrive in that sort of world of uncertainty in which we live. Once you have those two in place, we then are able to really see where our interdependence fits in. And we'll break these down, each one after the other. But the thing to take from that idea of interdependence is you can only be truly interdependent when you really have understanding in those other two areas. Only then do you see how you can apply that to be as effective and focused and aligned as you possibly can be. And it doesn't necessarily come from messaging up at the top of the organisation. It comes from that absolute understanding and clarity that runs through every level and every member of that team or that group.
Now, I have to take responsibility of the fact that we use an NFL football team as our example of a high-performing team. So you can't blame Ross for this one, even though he likes sports.
So if we were to look at an example of that high-performing team, we're going to take an NFL team because they are really focused and really finite in what they do and how they go about their business. So what it takes for that team to thrive in challenge is everybody knowing what it is that they are going to contribute, everybody knowing how they fit in to the success of that team, everybody knowing what success looks like, collaboration, interdependence, working together. But then, of course, on top of all of that, it needs to be well run, it needs to be clear in its leadership, and it needs to understand what the expectations are of each and every one of those team members. So if you were to get into a position where you imagine that the only people that know the move that that team is going to make at the next play are the coach, the QB, and the receiver, how well is that going to finish up for everybody? Everybody may be well-intended that they want the right thing to happen, but it is not going to be well-focused. In fact, I would think people will be getting in the way of success as they try to help. And we see this in many organisations. Whole organisations are attempting to succeed with everybody meaning well, but not everybody really understanding what the play is. And that is something that if we can get that across our teams and organisations through clear understanding, that's when we start seeing notable success.
So that's where we then start talking about this clarity of vision, this shared understanding that everyone within an organisation knows what your vision and your mission are, not just for today or tomorrow, but for the next year, the next 5 years, the next 10 years.
And because it's that is going to focus our decision making. And when we talk about where decision making needs to be, we'll get into that when we start talking a little bit more about clarity in leaders at all levels. But it's the context against which people are acting within the organisation. And for that, you need absolute clarity, an idea of shared understanding. So it means people understand the game and what their role is within it. Where do they fit in? What is it we're trying to achieve here? And you can look at it at a very simple level, mechanistically, I do this, but actually people need to understand, well, why do I do this? And if I need to do this differently in some way, what advantage does that give? And when that advantage is achieved, why does that put us a step forward? Why does that move us towards somewhere we're wanting to go? And how can I improve what I do now I know that that's actually what we're trying to achieve? It's not just what I do, it's why I'm doing it and where are we trying to get to. All of those factors are absolutely vital in people being able to give their best to an organisation. Because that big picture, that strategy, that aim that you're going at, it means people can respond rather than react. And that is hugely powerful across teams. So that each and every one of the activities building into that big picture, once that's absolutely clear, at that point we start being able to act interdependently and move our resources where we need to. And we'll come on to that obviously in a short while. So that clarity of purpose, that strategic aim is present within all levels of the organisation. It knows what it's trying to achieve. Everyone feels valued because they know where they fit in, and everyone knows why that is important and what they can do to improve where they can to make the difference to get to that goal that's clear and stated.
So we will just ask you just to take just a few moments of self-reflection to think, if I think about my team, does everybody in my team understand what the vision is for this organisation, for where I want to take us over the next year, 5 years? Just do that little bit of thinking and understand how that might impact on their engagement and the kind of collective success that you might have as people working together.
What are your goals? Do they know that? Do they know where they fit in with that? And in just a moment of self-reflection, sometimes we get very much into the habit of, we need to do this, we need to do this, we need to do this. And what that means is people become very dependent upon you because you've got the plan and you've got the clarity. If they know where they're trying to get to, my experience is many people are very surprised by how people pick that up and move it forward. So just have a think about that in your team. How are you developing some of your people? How are you working with the people you work with? And the other thing I really want to put out there is you don't have to be at the top of the organisation. When we get into the idea of leadership in a little while, and we will, we can get stuck on the idea that it depends how high up the organisation is. And in some organisations that might be reflected by, how much money you get or how close you park your car to the main entrance. That's not really what leadership is. Leadership happens everywhere. So even if you are a cog in that bigger machine, only when you know where your cog locks in are you truly able to pass that message around and help other people understand what they're doing for you and you're doing for them. It's that clarity of purpose. Not that clarity of here's what needs to be achieved, it's the what and the why that makes the difference.
So now we've thought a little bit about clarity, we're going to move on to talk about culture.
I think it's fair to say as we get through these, one of the things that everybody starts to see is that culture trumps everything. The way we think, the way we act, the way we behave, the way we treat each other, that is really the most important thing in any team or organisation. One of the things I think is, we'll invite you to have a little think about some of your culture in a short time, but one of the things we find very often is that people will end up with the culture they get because they aren't deliberate in the way that they develop, choose, and decide what they want their culture to be. And it takes hard work. You have to be demanding. You have to know what your culture wishes to look like and the behaviours that you need to see from the people you're with and around in order to make that happen. And so it's that idea of a shared ownership that welcomes challenge. It's that idea that, okay, we know what we need to do now. It's not the same as what we were doing before, but now we need to do this and we need to do it as effectively as we can. It's that can-do culture, rather than one that would resist doing something different because it is uncomfortable or uncertain. And I think I can think of very, very few industries or sectors where that is not happening, where that is happening faster than it's happening in agriculture. Vast amounts of rapid change. A need to be agile, and we'll come on to this in a short while, which is unprecedented, I think. Certainly unprecedented in its time, and almost unprecedented across any other sector I can think of. Things are changing unbelievably fast, and what will keep you in front is that idea of culture. So people are invested. They understand how they can thrive and they can bring their best game because they want to see that collective success. They learn just not from their mistakes, which is where many of us spend our time trying to learn. They learn from their successes. I'll come on to that in a moment. There's no blame culture. We're able to take calculated risks because we understand those risks. We step back and assess them. We step into them in a very deliberate way, understanding what it's supposed to look like, understanding what it is looking like now, and so how do we need to adjust and be flexible to make that work. And it's that strength of culture, that culture of pride, if you like. You've all, and you're going through tough times now. I don't know that because I see it. But there are always going to be tough times. And so actually being able to take pride in the fact that we can lean on some of our past experiences, we can lean on each other. That's part of that resilience piece. This is that resilient culture, because this is what we're aiming to do. This is what we're aiming to achieve across any organisation. So that idea of being able to face difficult situations, knowing that you can prosper and you can make that work. It's that shared ownership. It welcomes challenge.
And I think at a more sort of micro level, it's how do you treat each other? How do we treat each other in this team? What are our values? What do we bring to this? And one way you can get a very quick temperature gauge of that is if you stop and think, what would people say about us when we're not in the room? How do we reflect our values so that people see that from the outside? Because people will make decisions as to how they feel about your company or your organisation based on what they see. So that's really important, especially in an environment where customers are making more and more kind of choices about their purchasing based on ethical issues, based on all kinds of reasons that maybe have not been so kind of common historically.
And so that idea, particularly in agriculture, is the idea of how do we set ourselves apart? Because people will make buying decisions, and they will make buying decisions about what they see and what the impression they get from your organisation. And I can tell you, you can spend a huge amount of energy trying to build a false reality It's much easier, and believe me, it's much more beneficial for the organisation to actually live it and make it real and reflect it. Because the way that social media works, the way that buying decisions are made, it's your culture they're buying into. It's you and your attitudes that they want. And so when we talk about how do people talk about us when we're not in the room, that's exactly the same as how do people talk about us on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or however else they might choose to comment on us. That's really what we're trying to do. And if you can build the right culture that reflects in the right way, well then all that social media stuff's already done for you, really. You just need to take that reality and broadcast it out there, which is a much simpler way of doing it.
I'm going totally off path here, but it just made me think about Innocent Smoothies in the UK. They were a really interesting company that kind of marketed themselves in a quite funky, fun kind of a way. Somebody I knew worked for them, and they reflected that right through the way they did business in their culture. Their kind of coffee area wasn't a coffee area. They had fake grass and fake hills and, I mean, it's a very extreme example, but they took that sense of quirkiness, that sense of fun, and they ran that all the way through every layer of that organisation. It was really interesting, and they were hugely successful.
And to add to that, very interesting case study, they were then bought, actually, by Coca-Cola, I think, bought them.
Yeah.
And the whole thing just fell away. Yeah, they lost the magic, because the magic wasn't there anymore. And it was because they deliberately, if you like, tried to change that culture into the other corporate culture that failed woefully. It wasn't the same company anymore. And you don't see them in any reflecting that culture anymore because it's not there. Which is, again, really interesting. The other thing I would point out from this and from that slide is the idea of forensically examining success. You had some cards that I pushed out onto the table, and I gathered some of them that had a few responses on them. The idea of the question on there was to say, what's been your biggest business success in the last year? Now, a much easier question for many of you would have been, what's been your biggest business mistake or biggest business failure in the last 12 months? I bet people can answer that much more thoroughly than their biggest success. And I find this a lot. I travel around the world where organizations spend many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars examining why they lost. They are absolutely focused on why did we not win, why did we fail. Every time I get brought into an organization to understand what it was that failed for them, I start from the other end of the discussion, and I ask them a very simple question. Park all of that stuff about what you didn't want to happen. Tell me about something that worked well in the last 6 months. Tell me about your biggest business success in the last 6 months. And it takes them a very long time sometimes to actually voice what their biggest success was. If I say, tell me about your biggest failure in the last 6 months, they could give me the top 3 of those like that. And it's because of that negative cognitive bias, that idea that we're always chasing failure. You're not, you're chasing success. And understanding what it takes to win, that's how you win. Avoiding failure is something very different than seeking to win. So when I go through one of those sorts of organisational staring at our belly buttons and shuffling our feet sessions, I always start with, tell me about the best success. And then we run a chronology of it. What happened here? What happened here? What happened here? Why was that important? Because people don't generally understand why that success happened, not in a forensic way. If I say to them before we do that exercise, why did you win that? They'll go, oh, well, we were lucky. You weren't lucky. You did something right. And you did something right at the right time with the right person in the right way. And that is what is important. Understand that. Then take the thing that didn't go as well as you wanted it to and do a comparison. What's the good thing got that the bad thing hasn't? Now, not only do we understand why we didn't win, we now understand how to win. Specific behaviours and actions that we can take in order to succeed. You get in a culture that understands its successes, and that's when you're going to get a culture that repeatedly wins. We want to talk a bit more and sort of dive down to a little bit of detail around the idea of adaptability and having a culture and how you build adaptability into your organisation. It's not so long ago where people were selected in life and in business and in work and in anything else because of their IQ, their intelligence quotient. Yeah? You did well at school. You must be clever. You must be good at things. Well, I think all of us, and I can tell you, one person on this stage is the living embodiment of IQ, not quite where it ought to be. And I have just done just fine. And part of the reason I think I've done just fine isn't because my IQ is high.
No, it's because you married me.
Exactly. I bought in what I couldn't provide myself. No, far from it. IQ is not a, as we all know, a single designator of success. So the idea moved on, and it moved on to the idea of EQ, that emotional quotient, that ability to work and respond and react well with other people. And it became a good blend of, is this person intelligent? Can they work well and effectively with others? So that IQ-EQ blend was what people were looking for. Well, now we're looking much more at a third factor of that. It's that idea of adaptability, that dynamic and flexible thinking, being able to roll with change, roll with uncertainty. And if there's one phrase I would say, you're attempting to put the team for a problem, not a team for the problem. Because I promise you, the speed at which things change, context, circumstances, ability to adjust, you cannot build a team for the problem because it won't be the problem anymore. And then you're putting a lot of effort into something that isn't where you need your focus.
So often we will go into organisations who have spent an awfully long time deciding what the problem is, then trying to find the perfect people to solve and populate the team to face that problem. And as soon as you touch it, it's changed. So very much around get people who are adaptable, think about how you can flexibly respond, and then you're going to win every time.
Because that world is changing faster than ever before, and I certainly don't need to tell anybody in the room this, AQ becomes the key to remaining relevant and successful, trying to get ahead, but being okay with change. We are all generally relatively risk averse. Yeah? We have a negative cognitive bias that is positively selected through many generations so we don't get eaten by saber-toothed tigers. And so when we see and we have the response like we're about to put ourselves at risk, we tend to move away from that. And that's what change does to many of us, particularly if we are not the instigators of change. So when we think about those ideas of IQ, EQ, the other thing that is really important that people are trying to build into their organisations now is the concept of AQ. And what they generally try and do is build it into a system within their organisation and their team, when of course the real power is building it into their people. Because you can have as much of an ambition in AQ as you like, the people that have actually got to make that happen is the real people in the team. So they have to live and own that. And again, we put that in there as part of the culture because without that idea of adaptability, without that idea of being able to see what's coming down the track and position ourselves to benefit from it, then we're going to miss opportunities, or even worse, we're going to wither and die. And so we really need to keep this in mind in so much of what we're doing, and there is nowhere where that, I think, is moving faster than agriculture. So let's have a think about your team culture, and we're going to hand it back to you for a little bit. We understand that many of these things you get talked at, but I'm hoping what we've done in the last sort of few minutes, 10 minutes or so that we've started this, is put a few little ideas in your head and a few things that you might want to capture. The thing about doing this stuff is that it sparks a few ideas, it's interesting, amusing and a little bit diverting, but unless you capture it, it's gone. And it's kind of the way that we absorb thoughts, knowledge, and that kind of stuff nowadays. So how are we actually going to capture and know some of this stuff? So what's your team culture like now? Are there changes that you would like to see? Remember, if you aren't very deliberate in the culture that you wish within your team, your organisation, where you are, you'll get what you get rather than what you want. How can you be strategic and deliberate about changing the culture to something that you want to see and respond to?
So I would just say to that, what would people say about your team when you're not in the room?
Yeah, classic question. What behaviours are you going to reward and what ones are you going to value? And how are you going to feed that back? How actually are you going to support that stuff? And how will you make the cultural behavioural expectations clear? This is a real leadership challenge. When we talk about leaders at all levels, This isn't the top down, this is everybody. Leading self, leading together, leading others. How are we going to have those conversations that get the culture where we need it? We'll let you have a little discussion about that. And then finally, what behaviours aren't welcome? What are our red lines? And how do we call each other out in a way that isn't necessarily done to belittle or challenge, but is there to steer that idea of, you know what, we don't do it like that. And the reason we don't do it like that is for these reasons. What we would prefer to see is this.
One thing, sorry, I'm interrupting you. I do that. One thing that can be really helpful when you're thinking about this is if you have somebody new coming to join your organisation or your team, how are you going to explain this to them? How do you onboard that person so that they know how to fit in and what's expected of them?
So if you're sat next to somebody you don't know, just share a quick sentence and say, the culture in which I work, the culture in which my organisation, team, my farm, whatever it happens to be, the way we do things is this.
Our values are.
And then state whether that's something you value or don't. What would you like to see more of? And then think about how can we get more of that stuff. So let's just have a 2-minute conversation, because as I say, we've been talking for a while now, and it's great. I can see people writing on cards, capturing some of their thoughts. What I anticipate will happen is we'll be quiet for a little while, then there'll be quite a lot of talking, and then I'll be working quite hard to wrestle control back and start talking again in about 5 minutes' time. That's what tends to happen. So, over to you. Yeah, sure. Okay, so again, this is the bit where I try and wrestle control back again. But now we're talking about culture, so we're off, aren't we? Okay, good. I was hearing some great conversations in there, and of course, they often start quite broad and then return back to being quite narrow. Actually, one of the bits of feedback that I had outside of the conversations was that I speak a bit funny, and I confess, speak a bit funny. And also that some of the mics and things aren't working as well as some people would like. So if you do need to come in and close down, look, I've terrified 5 tables away from here. So if anybody needs to move a little bit closer, so you can lip read or whatever else you need to do as I speak my southern London English accent, then please do so, and you'll be able to keep up. Good. I saw some great conversation. I heard some great conversations being had there. And it was really actually about how do we take some of the things that we would like to see and we would like to develop and grow more of those things. And some of it really comes down to some great ideas coming from over there, but also I was sort of bumping into challenges with feedback. And how do we feed back? And how do we get that message back to say, this is what we want, please do more of this, because this is something we see as being really reflective of what we want to see happening. And so when we talk about feedback, we structure it, we're very specific about what we say. We talk about the impact that behaviour had. Then we talk about the feelings that produced within us and within others. And then we look to the future to say, so next time, could you please do this? As a really simple way of feeding back. The thing to remember is the way I described that, again, we slip typically into a negative cognitive bias. Many people will be thinking about delivering negative feedback, stopping a behavior they didn't want. Actually, much more powerful to consistently feedback on behaviors that you do want. And when we think about the balance of positive to negative feedback, it's about 8-to-1. 8 positives will make somebody believe that they are above that 1 negative feedback. And so what we see so commonly is us feeding back off curbstone saying, please don't do that, please don't do that, please don't do that. We need to be feeding back constantly the times that they're in the channel they need to be in to get done what they need to. So the idea of that is really important in our feedback. And that's how we guide it, really. And we have that conversation that says, we're going to feed back, and we're going to feed back to ourselves and each other about how we do this. Oh, mic on. You might get feedback.
What do you think the most common form of feedback is in an organisation? None. Yeah, none. Yeah.
Yeah, no feedback is the most common. Negative is the next most common. And the one trailing way off down there is that reinforcing positive feedback. Normally, nothing gets said. So people just carry on with what they were doing. And if people carry on with what they were doing and it wasn't what you wanted, that's how you end up with the culture you get rather than the one you want. So you have to be able to feedback effectively. Good. So we've had a little look at clarity. We've understood a little bit more about why that is important, what that gives us. Now we're moved through culture. Remember, culture, that's the one that will get you through. That's the one that trumps all. And then as we start moving on down, we'll understand a little bit now about the idea of interdependence, where we have collaboration and not competition. And another great little culture discussion I just heard over there sort of calls in on some of these ideas. So interdependence, your team stands strong, individuals rely on the team and they draw their strength from one another. That idea that the strength of the wolf is in the pack, the strength of the pack is in the wolf. It's that everybody supporting each other to maximum effect. Together they're greater than the sum of their parts, a phrase that often gets used. And that they're confident they will receive support when they need it. What's the real challenge to people receiving support when they need it? They don't ask for it. And actually, a really confident, really high-performing team will ask for support when it needs it. Because it's aiming at the outcome. It's aiming at achieving the goal. Not my personal dignity about whether I can manage to do this as quickly, as effectively as I had hoped. If I can't, I've still got to achieve the goal. So I'm going to get over myself and ask for some assistance, some help or some guidance. Really important to be able to do that. Confident you can receive support, confident that you don't be judged when you ask for it. And then, of course, knowing when to step up and knowing when to play a supporting role. You're not going to be front and centre the whole time. You are not going to be the organisational priority every single day. So don't fight other people within the organisation as if you are or as if you want to be, because you simply won't be. There are times where if you gave some of your effort, some of your thinking, some of your resourcing to support somebody else, they will achieve their goal quicker, more effectively, and may well leave more resources in the pot as a result of that for when the spotlight shifts back to you. That's true interdependence. That's real confidence in high-performing teams.
And I guess this is where we can come back to our analogy, or my favourite analogy, of the football team again. So at this point, we don't just have the coach, the QB and the receiver knowing the play. You've got people running interference. You've got fake routes being run. You've got people blocking. Therefore, you're more successful. They're not all going to be the one that carries the ball across the line and necessarily gets the glory, but they understand that the goal is for everybody to win. We either all win together or we all fail together.
And sometimes when we look at understanding that idea of building independence, that collaborative team approach, sometimes we need to be able to think outside the box. Sometimes when we're looking at how we collaborate, we need to be thinking about who's in your team. It's a really fundamental question that I ask very many organisations, and many will give me a very trite answer about, well, you know, who's in my team, i.e. who's in my bit of the organisational diagram, or who's in my department, or who's on my payroll. All of those ideas, they're not who's in your team. And I've been doing this a few years now, and it's probably took 6 years before I finally figured out the really effective answer to who is in your team. If your success is dependent upon them, they are in your team. Now, sometimes that might be a little bit uncomfortable because you may not like them. Sometimes it might be that you already have an adversarial relationship with them, which makes it a little bit difficult. But if your success relies upon them, you have to be able to have a communicative and productive relationship with those people. They need to understand what you're trying to achieve, you need to understand what they are trying to achieve, and you need to be able to move that forward mutually. So it's very much that idea, if you like, of understanding who am I really in competition with. Great example we were just discussing there a little bit in culture, where people form teams. We naturally form teams. Probably the greatest strength of humans is the ability to form teams. However, the greatest weakness of human beings is the ability to form teams. Because we naturally do it. We create in-groups and out-groups. And as soon as we create that idea of an in-group and an out-group, now we're in competition. And sometimes it's entirely inappropriate to be in competition with those people. We did a really interesting discussion with ski resorts, the Eastern Seaboard ski resorts, USA and Canada. And they were sat in a room very similar to this one. It wasn't quite this one, but not far away from here. And you could see each of the resorts sat at the table. And we said, who's your competition? And naturally, they're looking not only at the other ski resorts and the other ski hills, they're looking at the one that might be nearest to them geographically as their competition.
They actually started sort of throwing paper at each other at one point, I think, didn't they?
And after a very short discussion, we began to realise that their competition was not sitting in that room. Their competition was ice hockey. Their competition is the Xbox. Their competition is people deciding to stay indoors and not get outside and enjoy the amazing winters that we have in this part of the world. That's their competition. They're not fighting for the skiers. The skiers are already there. They need more skiers. They need more snowboarders. They need more people doing that sport. And it's exactly the same in whatever sector you're in. And it's the same in agriculture. You need more people who are valuing what you produce. Don't scrabble around for the ones that already value it. And that comes from collaboration, building trust, building a bigger idea of what constitutes your team. And so sometimes that does take you to think outside the box.
So actually, coming back to the idea of forensic success, that group, by the end of the day, had strategized a plan whereby they had roaming tickets that people could buy so that you could visit multiple hills. If you had a membership of one hill, you then got a 10% discount of any other Atlantic ski hill. So starting to do that, they started to work out how they could broaden their market, how they could make it more appealing to people who may not have previously considered skiing as something they might do.
And so what you're trying to do is not compete for the fish that are in the little pond, get a bigger pond with more fish in it. That's really where we're trying to go when we talk about real, true interdependence in that bigger level, that cooperation and collaboration rather than competition. And you know, when we talk about reinforcing success and doing more of what's going well, I've only been hanging out with you for a very short while, but I'm picking that up all over the place, actually. It's something that's really strong here. So how can we deliberately build that? Who do we need to go and have a conversation with where we can grow that? Grow your sector, grow your product, whatever it happens to be. You know, grow your province, grow Canadian agriculture. Because your competition isn't close to you, your competition is very much further away. You've got to decide where that will sit. So let's have a conversation very quickly. List down who's in your team. Who is your success dependent upon? One of the really big ones that people forget, of course, is their customers and their clients. They'll often remember them as being very dependent for their success, but do they really have them in their team? Are they really having a mutually beneficial conversation about how we can both get what we need out of this in a really effective way? Find out which of those stakeholders and how are you going to engage with them? How are you going to start that conversation? And how do we then put that together? And is there any other way that we could lever some of our other stakeholders to increase this success? Who's got other routes in? Because again, everything's linked up. We're moving into a world where everything links with everything else. And we need to be into that network. We need to understand that. And we need to see where we sit with that. So when we talk about who's in your team, just have a little discussion now. Same as we did before, maybe slightly shorter this one. Decide who's in your team. Decide who your success is dependent upon. Just note those down, and we can take them away and start that campaign of engaging with them after we finish on Sunday. Let's do that. Okay, let's draw that conversation down. We were hearing some really interesting examples there, actually, about the idea around collaboration. And that idea of how do we maximise that relationship. One of the things I remember doing some work with some producers here, and a lot of it was around logistics, actually, but it was putting some of the emphasis back on the logistics providers to offer up when they've got an opportunity where they might be moving through a certain place with a half load or running empty, or all of those things that make it massively expensive to ship your stuff, and obviously expensive for the logistics company as well. Well, how do they offer up that space so that somebody else can say, well, actually, if you're moving from here to here, I've got a load, but I need to move from here to here. And it's fine, I'll sit on it for another 3 days because I know there's one coming through. And that means it costs the other user of that logistics less, and it costs you less, and it costs the logistics company less because nobody's running empty. It's little things like that that make a really big difference. So how do we make that happen? And there are some really interesting ways that people are finding to collaborate like that. You know, there's an app right there, isn't there? That space app that helps people understand what's moving, what I need to move, what's available. That sort of thing will really improve that. Good. So that answer around who's in your team. Now we're going to move on to sort of that idea we pulled out really earlier in the talk when we thought about leaders at all levels. And I talked about what it is that makes a team truly high performing. Leaders at all levels are really the key to making your team optimize for success. What it means really in simple terms is the right decisions are being made by the right people at the right level of the organisation, and they are able to put that into practice at their level. What you find in many more hierarchical organisations, and it's this idea of bandwidth that we were mentioning before, is if you have a top-down organisation, your organisation is only ever going to be as good as the bandwidth that sits at the top of it, because everything's fed into it. With clarity, people understand what it is they're trying to achieve. With a culture of trust, a culture of enabling people to act, that's when you start getting leaders at all levels who are able to make the right decisions for the right reasons, at the right levels, and enact them.
And when we think about resilience, which you've spent time talking about, that is absolutely key in resilience, because then anybody can afford to have a bad day, a bad week, because it doesn't all come down to the right decision being made by just one person. Everybody knows what the big picture is, and everybody's able to pull in the right direction.
That idea of shared leadership. What I think, the phrase that you hear doing what I do, working in leadership a lot, is the idea of heroic leadership. Well, heroic leadership, that is that single point of decision making, that single point that everything goes through. There is massive risk in that. If people are understanding what it is they need to achieve, they are absolutely confident and capable of being able to do that, and are resourced and supported to do it, that's when you get leaders at all levels. Because otherwise you are only ever as good as the bandwidth of the bottleneck of decision making and action.
The other thing we need to think about is the key importance of leaders at all levels when you have safety critical environments. This is something which Ross spends a lot of time working with gas and oil.
Yeah, oil and gas massively into their leading safety, and I deliver quite a lot of work with them because it's about taking responsibility. It's about doing the right thing at the right level, being able to speak out as you should, leading from your position everywhere else in the organisation, whether I'm leading myself, whether I'm leading others, or whether I'm leading up the organisation to make things clear to people. And the absolute key to leadership in a safety critical environment is that it's shared and everybody owns it. And I think there's one industry which outdoes agriculture as far as safety concerns it becomes vitally important for you to be able to be safe by leading at all levels.
So everyone being prepared to speak out if they see something being done in a way that it shouldn't be done, everybody taking personal responsibility and accountability for what everybody else is doing.
Yeah. Nothing gets given away, everything gets owned by the right person at the right level. And the way we do that, when we talk about coaching as the preferred style of leadership, there's a lot of stuff that sort of floats around coaching, and we'll come onto it in a little bit more later when we talk about a coaching culture. Coaching is really about being very clear on what it is you're trying to achieve, understanding the reality of the organisation, but also understanding the reality of the person that needs to put that into place, but then also giving them the opportunity, the resources, and have them form the plan themselves as to how they are going to put that into place. And that idea of coaching as a style of leadership, that's really what coaching is at its very best. And we'll talk more about that in a short while. And again, it's that idea of the leadership style that we have. I've mentioned it before. Think about, how does your leadership impact upon the culture of your organisation? One of the real challenges is we all tend to lead in the way that we would like to be led. But as we all know, anybody who's in a position of leadership, not everybody likes to be led in the same way. So true leadership is about being able to behave in the right way for the right person at the right time in the right context. And that actually takes quite a lot of thinking about, quite a lot of consideration. And so in what ways are you supporting leaders at all levels? How are you giving away the responsibility that should be held at that level? And I say this to you, I spend a lot of time in organisations where it's about trying to create that coaching style of leadership. And actually, it's a much easier conversation to talk to people at the top end of an organisation and invite them to give away responsibility further down the organisation. I find that there are some challenges with that, but actually, overall, that's pretty easy. People nowadays are quite good at giving away that responsibility. The real challenge is to have people pick up that responsibility and take it forward. Giving it away is easy. Picking it up and taking it and being held accountable and having expectations around your performance and what you do, people are much more reluctant to pick it up than they are to put it down, in my experience. So how do you build that culture of accountability and responsibility across your teams? And again, that's how you do that as a leader. You have expectations of your team. And think about, so how can I develop my leadership practices? How can I ask good questions? How can I maximize my team's performance? Very quick example maybe of coaching and coaching in the moment as a style of leadership. Somebody comes to you with an issue, might be a problem. That's what most people take to their boss. They bring a problem and what do they want to do? They want to give it to you to solve it for them. Okay? Well, in a shared leadership environment, in a coaching leadership environment, actually the conversation runs like this. 3 relatively simple questions. Somebody brings you a situation and you say, okay, what's going on? What do you think we should do about it? Do you need me to assist in any of that? And the answer generally is, what's going on? They understand it better than you do. What do they think they should do about it? Well, they understand the context and reality much better than anybody else does. And so by then putting that back on them and saying, so what do you need from me to make that happen? Generally, if you haven't taken ownership of the problem, it sits back with them. And that's where it should be. It kills that culture of dependency. You want to build that culture of independence. What's going on? What do you think we should do about it? What do you need from me? And that works whether it's anywhere. That worked for me. I'll tell you a brief story about being in Afghanistan in a couple of moments. But that same list of questions worked for me if I've got a 22-year-old troop commander with 3 call signs in contact and casualties. I ask exactly the same questions. What's going on? What do you need to do about it? What do you need from me? Because I can't solve it for him. Only he can.
And when people start to expect that from you, they then stop coming to you with problems and they start coming to you with a situation and a suggested solution. It takes a little bit of time, but it does happen, and it happens relatively quickly. And actually, teams thrive on that because there's then a sense of engagement, a sense of ownership, a sense of investment. So when something goes well, it's their success, it's not your success. And that's the real key to high-performing teams, is this developing leaders at all levels who are engaged, who are empowered, who feel that they own the results of that company, that organisation, of that team, whoever it happens to be.
So when you have that coaching culture, that idea of asking good questions but expecting action as a result of understanding the situation, that's when you get the leaders at all levels. You get people empowered to bring the best to the table. Interdependence, which I told you was the most difficult one and intangible to grab, well, that's what you start to see up and down the organisation. As Catherine's already mentioned, at the same speed that people get better at coaching, people get better at being coached. You stop bringing a problem without bringing the solution.
We don't really have time to delve into this today in a great deal of detail, but there's a reason why a coaching approach to leadership is now the preferred approach across most organisations, and certainly big organisations. And it's not because they're fluffy and they want people to feel happier, although that's great. It's because it makes them more money. Because actually, you've got people invested in getting it right.
And it's the right people solving the problem at their level and being empowered to do so. Because things move too fast to have problems going up and down and across silos. It just needs to be dealt with in the moment as quickly as possible in the most appropriate way. And that's what a coaching culture allows you to have. And as Catherine mentioned, the reason why it's there, yes, it makes people happier, but more importantly, it makes money.
Yeah. And the other thing, it saves money because you have far lower levels of staff turnover because people are engaged and feel like they actually want to stay. And it costs an awful lot of money every time you lose somebody from your organisation. The amount of time you lose having to go out and work out how to set up a competition, how to advertise, how to then bring that new person on board until they're up to speed. The figures are staggering as to how much it costs.
HBR found that it is generally between 150 and 175% of the annual wage of that individual is what it costs you to replace them. In lost productivity, lost corporate knowledge, lost skills, all the other stuff, the HR stuff that goes around that. So, can this really be applied to our organisation, is the question? Well, it's easy when you look at something like a professional football team, as we've already mentioned, the Patriots there, you've seen them. They've got unlimited resources and they sit within a fairy tale existence, don't they? It's not really real. But when it comes down to the real stuff, when we all sit with that challenging of resourcing, the red tape, all of those things that we find pushing in on us in the real world, well, how can we make that happen? How can leaders affect the sort of change in those kind of circumstances? I'm going to tell you a very quick story. And it's about Whiskey Company, who I commanded on my 3rd tour in Afghanistan, and how we met the challenges of that tour using that model of CCI and using that model of leaders at all levels, and very much with the idea of a coaching approach. And I'll put it out there early, and it will become clear as I go through the story. The reason why people came through that and had their lives protected was because we adopted this way of doing business. And I'll tell you a story towards the end where it saved my life. Whether I was the instigator of all of this stuff or not, I can tell you that I'm alive today as a result of building that idea within a really high-performing team. So, our tour of Afghanistan, we knew about it about 9-10 months before we were due to deploy. So we very quickly wanted to set about understanding what it was we were going to do. We were seeking clarity as much as possible. And so we built into our ideas of finding out how and what we were going to seek to achieve when we got to Afghanistan, really by asking everybody in the company, and at that stage it was about 120 people, every single person in that company who deployed to Afghanistan before stood up and gave a 10-minute brief about their experiences of their tours previously in Afghanistan. And it was really quick that we started to see themes coming out in what people were saying and what they were talking about. Very quickly, we could see frustration with the approaches that we've been taking in the past to try and find success in that country, in that circumstance. It became really clear that what we were facing here was a political and economic problem. And the problem with that is the way to solve it is through politics and economics. Does that strike you as having a great deal of politics and economics attached to it? We were the wrong tool for the job. And so what we understood was that we were going to have to change our nature. We were going to have to change our culture to fit what the problem actually was. Quoted to me by a 19-year-old Marine. He'd done one tour of Afghanistan before, and he said, "You know what the problem is?" He said, It's like trying to understand how you're going to bring reconstruction and development to a 13th century agrarian economy. They haven't really got any interest in what we are trying to give them because it's not what they want. And suddenly, the lights start coming on. What do they need, and where is our contribution for how we can help them do that? So everybody stood up. And everybody gave their 10 minutes. And we started to understand really clearly what the problem actually was and how we are going to have to be different in the way that we face this problem. Because we knew what we'd be doing, we knew how we'd be developed to go there, and we knew what we'd be good at when we got there. But what we'd all realised is we're going to be good at the wrong thing. And having understood that, all of a sudden, we find ourselves deployed to Norway for 3 months. Does that look like that's going to be particularly useful on our next tour of Afghanistan? No, it isn't. So we needed to find the opportunities to really develop those areas of us, see this not as a setback, but see it as the opportunity to develop things. So we knew as soon as we got back and we went into the pre-deployment cycle, we're going to do an awful lot of shooting, we're going to bring in an awful lot of artillery, and we're going to see a lot of fast jets doing their thing, because of course that's our nature, remember, we're military. But we're thinking, we need to be political and economic in the way we do this. How can we get ahead of the game? So we got ahead of the game by taking that trip to Norway and learning how to shoot, polishing our skills as teams, getting really, really good at the military stuff. So we did what we always do in Norway. We skied about for a bit. We did a little bit of aggressive camping. But every time we did that, we were firing our weapons live. We were getting good at those low-level skills like we needed to. So I knew by the time we came back from there, we'd got all that. We knew how to do all of that stuff, and that every man in that company could stand and at 200 metres hit a bottle top from a standing position. We knew we could do that. So then when we got into the sort of training proper, we were able to develop the areas that were really important to us. We could seek those advantages that we'd learned from having that really early clarity of what it was that we were doing. And so it's not a great picture, but the guy stood there with a red patch on his arm. That right there is my military policeman. And what we're doing there is we're doing yet another live firing compound assault where we take down the building. Yeah, okay, that's useful and helpful, but how does that help us build that political and economic requirement that we know we're trying to do when we get there? Well, what we contribute to the political side is security. And if we're bringing security, then what we need is to bring legitimacy to the security that that government provides. And that legitimacy comes from things like prosecutions. It comes from the judicial system. It comes from law enforcement. That's the important thing. That's what supports the political side. So the reason why my military policeman's at the front of every single thing we do is because he's the guy that understands the evidence chain. He's the guy that keeps us doing the right things so that the security side of what that government provides, the political element, is fully met. And so, funnily enough, we started to look and behave a little bit differently. And yeah, we went in and we threw grenades and forward rolled behind the furniture and did all the stuff that looks really great. But all the time we were doing that, we were thinking about why are we doing it? And we did look different. And I could see members of my team, we're getting ridiculed in the end because, what are you doing that for? Because, that's not nearly as much fun as throwing another grenade. Well, actually, it's because we're trying to get fit for purpose. And the thing was, of course, is that the laughing stopped when they started looking at the scoring, because they score all of this stuff. And they start looking at the scoring for the shooting, they start looking for the scoring of that. Because we've done all that in Norway, so we're knocking that out of the park. But what we're doing is we're building on top of that, growing our capabilities. So by the time we got there, we were in a much better shape to understand what our job was. But there was one thing that we couldn't get as far advanced as we wanted to before we went, and that was the idea of the IED, the improvised explosive device. Now, the information on these things at the time was very scant. It was very hard to understand what was going on within Afghanistan in this area, and it was almost as if people were trying to keep it a little bit secret. We knew that the casualty rates were very high from these things, and we knew that these were going to be the major threat. But of course, we don't see them as a major threat to what we're doing. We're seeing them as getting in the way, because what they are doing is preventing us having the political and economic impact that we need to have. So how do we get this out the way so we can concentrate on what's important? And we could get no information anywhere, and it was hanging over us. But we wouldn't give up to it because we had a culture that thought, no, we can come past most of this stuff. And our clarity was pointing to these as being as important, but we couldn't figure out how we were going to move on from it. So, leaders at all levels. And that's what we were growing in the organisation. That's what we'd grown when we did the stories for 10 minutes. That was leaders at all levels that got us past this. Because I said, right, we've got to figure out how we're going to be able to meet this challenge. And a Lance Corporal, who hadn't long been a commander actually, put his hand up at the back and said, you know what, I used to be in the engineers, and we used to teach people how to build booby traps. And that's all that is. That's just a well-designed booby trap. So once we figure out how to build a booby trap, we'll know how to build an IED. Okay, so then we start to understand the IEDs. And then what we do is we develop that idea. So not only do we build them, and incidentally we didn't build absolutely real ones, we built them as dummies, but once we'd built them, then we'd go and hide them and invite other people to come and see if they could find them. And if they could find them, they'd say, the reason I found that was because of this. And if they couldn't find them, well, that's the really interesting conversation to say, what would we have needed to be able to do to find that device? What did you do that made that so difficult? So then when we got there, this thing that was forever going to be the biggest problem we had there, we understood our problem. We knew what our challenge was and we knew what our capabilities were. When I talk about it saving our lives, that AQ, that leading at all levels, that was what kept us, and I'm a personal example of this, alive. And I'll tell you a story about what leading at all levels actually looks like. So, part of our area, in a little town called Sangin, you can see it's very built up. It's quite a compressed urban environment, and what you get is compounds, 15-foot high compound walls with very thin alleyways that move between them. If you're laying IEDs, that is an absolutely perfect environment in which to cause very high casualties. So it's very difficult to work in those areas. And I was working with a team I had out on the eastern side of Sangin, which is where that picture is, and they lived this every single day, and it was brutal for them. A really difficult place to be. By the time we'd been in Sangin 2 months, on average, we were finding an IED every 22 hours. And, more concerningly, even with all the understanding we had, we were getting struck by an IED on average every 90 hours. That's what we're up against, trying to get us through this job. So, I'm patrolling with a team out in Wishton. I don't get there as often as I wish to, but I will spend as much time with that team as I possibly can. And the way that they patrol through that environment, they split into 3 teams, and they work on 3 different axes. The guy commanding that patrol that day was a guy called Corporal Baz O'Connell. Corporal Baz O'Connell is quite a character. He's a physical training instructor outside of being a commando. He's built like a tank. He's got a head like one of those statues from Easter Island, and he is a wholly impressive man. I'm there as the company commander, but I am not commanding that patrol because I don't know those streets like he knows those streets. I don't do things as well as he does in there. So why would I be in charge of that? That is a recipe for disaster. So that day, I'm patrolling with them, and I'm in the group on the right-hand side. He's in the central team, and there's another 5 guys on the left-hand side, and we're moving up 3 axes. At the very front of the patrol is a young man called Marine Irving, and he is just turned 18 years old. He's one of the youngest men in the company, and he's the guy that, as they patrol forward, has got the metal detector. And he doesn't just metal detect the floor, he metal detects the walls. He goes right up, 6 feet up the walls, higher if he can reach that far, because that's where these things are being implanted to trap us. He's one of the youngest men with every bit of responsibility for the safety of everybody behind him. He doesn't even hold his weapon ready because he's more focused on spotting where those IEDs are. So we're advancing up and we come to an open area. I can't see this going on because I'm on the right-hand side. However, as they come into a small clearing, Marine Irving glances up and there's a guy who's got an IED next to him. He's digging a hole with a small shovel, and he glances up, sees Marine Irving coming around the corner doing his checks, clocks what's going on, he's up and he's running. Round the corner at the same moment comes Baz O'Connell. He's not quick enough to react because the guy's already running, and suddenly we think, right, we've got an IED in place, sir, and now we can capture him. And so what we would traditionally do is we would go either side of that as fast as we can, 200 or 300 meters into depth. We close off behind that, and then we systematically search all the way back through all of those buildings, all of those alleyways, all of those places, wells that he'll be hiding in, and eventually we find him. And so that was the order that Baz O'Connell gave. He said, teams 1 and 2, 200 meters in depth, move now. And we know that now we're going to go. Now, I didn't get that order, but suddenly everybody starts running. And I'm thinking, right, we're in a pursuit here, so let's go for it. And I was once in my life a half-decent athlete, and I'm really keen that I get there quite quickly. So I'm really moving fast down this alleyway. As that order is given, Marine Irving, 18 years old, most junior man in the company, turns to Baz O'Connell and he says, stop, don't do that. Quietly, understated, stop, don't do that. Baz O'Connell looks at him, and he presses his radio and he says, teams 1 and 2, stop, 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 go firm now. And he turns to Marine Irving and he said, this better be good, mate, because he knows he's missed the opportunity. That guy's been hammering us day in, day out for 3 months. And he knows that he's gone now. He knows we can't catch him. And as way of an answer, Marine Irving stands there and says, he wouldn't put an IED there. That's an illogical place. We'd find it. We're not going to traffic that area very often. It's not choke pointed. It's obvious. He would not put an IED in the ground there unless he wants you to chase him. And suddenly it all went quiet. And Baz O'Connell gives the next order and he says, okay, deliberate search, on axis, 200 meters, deliberate search, which means to slow down, do everything incredibly carefully, which we did. And on the left-hand side, on the other team, within 150 meters, we found 1 pressure plate IED and 2 command wire IEDs. They're the ones that touch the wire together and it'll explode. On the axis I'm on, we've got 2 pressure plate IEDs and a command wire IED. And of course, the plan in all of that is to have us run as fast as we can into depth and have those pressure plate IEDs go off and then wait. and then wait for the casualty evacuation to come, wait for the medics to come, wait for everybody else that's going to be drawn in by that mass casualties, and then just start popping off those command wire IEDs to increase the casualty count and cut us to ribbons. And that's what would have happened. But the impressive thing about leadership at all levels, when Maureen Irving turned round and said, "Stop, don't do that," Baz O'Connell did not say why. Because if he'd simply said why, we'd still be running. And the length of time it would have taken Maureen Irving to explain that, I would have been on top of one of those devices. I would have travelled that distance at that speed. What truly shows that is leadership at all levels and a coaching culture is how Baz O'Connell, without hesitation, takes that from the youngest, most junior man in the organisation and says, "Stop. Everybody stop." And that decision that he made means that I'm able to walk around on a stage and step off it and do all the rest of the stuff if I'd be here at all as a result of that. So that's what it looks like when it's real. So all of this stuff in theory that we stand up and give you, all those ideas that you see in business literature and leadership magazines and all the rest of that stuff, your challenge is to say, well, what does that mean to me in my organisation? And that's what it meant in mine. That's what a coaching culture and leadership at all levels look like. And the reason why that had to be a coaching culture is I could not make all of those decisions. I could not lead everything. Impossible. I was completely overwhelmed by both the scale, the volume, and the situation. So only by putting those decisions being made by the right people at the right time and the right level were we ever going to find success. And that came right from the building blocks, right at the very front end, that came from that clarity, that culture that we had, and that pure interdependence that genuinely gives you that leadership and decision-making at all levels. So, does it have to be a perfect environment? Does it have to be well-resourced? No, it can be anywhere. It's just a case of finding the opportunity and exploiting it where you can. That's all I've got to discuss, really. However, I would very much welcome a few moments of questions, if anybody has any. Some silence. Could be around anything. Oh, yeah.
I'll take the challenge. So you were talking about leaders at all levels at a point there, and I often struggle with. We have teams down at the sort of the ground level, and I just wonder how to appoint that. Do you appoint a leader of that group, of that team, or should you kind of do like a call out about who wants to be the leader?
Yeah, and of course there's also that idea around, you give somebody the leadership and then they almost feel like, now they have to take it. Mm-hmm. And so there's a real challenge, I think, with that. One of the things where I've seen the need for leadership and leadership being thrust upon somebody is to have a conversation with a few different people and ask them, say, if this team was led in the best way possible, what would it look like? How would that work? And get a few opinions. You might find that it's not necessarily the person that you think is in the best place, and they may not even think they're in the best place to lead it. But actually, start those conversations. One of the things that goes back to that tour in Afghanistan, it was expensive. We had 9 people killed, we had 57 battle casualties. And the people I lost predominantly were corporals and machine gunners, because corporals bring the battle to the enemy. And so I had, by the end, there were no further replacements. There was nobody else we could bring in. So people were getting promoted constantly into roles that they weren't trained and necessarily developed for. And one of the questions I used to make 2 things clear. When I gave them that responsibility, I would say, okay, you are now in the tent. You are now able to speak to me about anything without hindrance, free communication channel, go for it. The other thing I used to say is, before you take that role as a corporal, think about the best ever corporal you've ever worked for and pretend to be them. You give them 6 weeks, that idea of fake it till you make it, yeah? In 6 weeks' time, they've grown into that, and they are the very best that they've seen because they're thinking about and being deliberate about their leadership behaviours. But how you select that, sometimes it's a case of you thinking, I do need that culture of that team needs that kind of leadership from that kind of individual, and you select it. Sometimes it might be the team saying they all respect that individual, so that's a natural fit. Or other times it's a case of saying, okay, does anyone want to take this forward and we'll strategise how we can make that work. It isn't easy, but it does depend on the culture of that team. Help me understand a little bit more. What's the challenge for that team when it does, or what's the challenge for that team without that sort of leadership? Is really what I'm trying to ask. Does it have it now?
The challenge without a leader? The challenge, I guess, how I see it is basically a mode of communication with the manager above. So I feel like there needs to be someone who is the point person of that team, and also that has the confidence to give instruction without the presence of a manager.
Okay, so you're really looking for a leader at all levels.
Yes. Well, yes.
Yeah. Again, and so would that be stated? Would that be peer leadership?
Peer, yeah.
Peer leadership, yeah. And again, that's a cultural thing, really. An example is important in that. There are people out there who we naturally turn to. You got someone in mind who you think would be good for that?
Well, I have done it, and I find sometimes by just appointing it, there is a little bit of dissension amongst the team members.
Yeah.
Because how come he picked you? Kind of attitude.
Yeah, interestingly, we're working with a team at the moment who were experiencing that exact problem. And in the end, they came to quite a novel solution, actually. They decided that they wanted to continue to work very collaboratively and didn't really want to pick a particular person, so they actually are rotating a kind of a communication role. So that was just a different way of doing it. So they all are taking responsibility, they're all leading, and the challenge, the only reason they really needed a leader was to make sure that information came up and down. And so they just on a monthly basis rotating that responsibility. I'm not saying that's a solution for you, but it is the solution that they came up with that worked for them.
When we're doing that safety critical leadership stuff, very often you do that sort of end of shift. And one of the things we do is we say it isn't always the same person that reports back end of shift or end of job. It would be anyone within the group. And that means that they understand what's going on, they understand what they were doing, and they were taking notice as they did it. It wakes everybody up a bit. So sharing that, reporting back's a good idea, and I've seen that done in a number of different areas. So yeah, you could do that, but end of shift, end of week, whatever it is, what do we want to feed back as a team? What do I need to go and tell the boss? What do we need to hear?
Okay, thank you.
Any others? There's some time.
Some tumbleweeds out there.
Yeah. I know. Yep.
Hi.
Yeah. Hello.
My question is, I guess many of us on farms are dealing with family, and our teams are family businesses. How do you create better leaders or better coaching or create a better culture when you're working with family? Do you have any suggestions there?
I do actually.
Because he has to work with me.
Yeah. Yes. I'm not the sharpest pencil in the box working with a clinical psychologist. Who do you think has got the upper hand there? Yeah, and actually, I've seen this in a farm situation here in New Brunswick. And one of the things that we were brought into was to look at the strategic plan for that producer. And it was a family. What we discovered as we went through that was we were amazed about the conversations that weren't being had. And it's sometimes easier to do that from a step away. But only once we got into that strategic plan did we realise that generationally, predominantly, there were completely different ideas about where this was going. Completely different ideas about event horizons and decision points. Really very diverse. And when we said, well, have you talked about this? Well, no, because everyone was kind of assuming that we sit around the breakfast table in the morning, decide what needs to happen, and it's a cranberry bog, and then we go out and do it. But at no point did they ever come back and actually have those real strategic conversations. And it didn't matter if it was a month out conversation or a 3 years out conversation. They just never had them. So we put together this sort of strategic plan, and what it did was it opened up the discussion. So everybody read it, and within it there was a lot of information, about the market and about the situation and organics and all the rest of that stuff, and it became a talking point. So then they started having those conversations about where we're getting, so things started to align. So then you've got something to focus on, and then it's easy to have a sort of leadership style conversation about, well, where does all this fit in? If I go and do that, how's that working towards this as the outcome? And so that was a real example of how that whole farming agricultural family thing, they just weren't having the conversations. And they were in the relationships that they were in within the family, if you see what I mean. And eventually, generationally, do we ever stop being parents? Well, I think if we're in a business together, we have to, was one of the things I took away from that. That parenting role and parenting position, at a certain point, needs to be a peer discussion. Because now we're talking business, not us as a family.
There was the clarity piece, really.
It was the clarity, yeah, definitely. That's what we worked on. Because they just didn't have the conversation. I don't know if that helps, but that was the living example I saw of that in a cranberry bog not far away. Yeah. Any others? I think we're probably about the time. If there's nobody else. Rhonda, are you happy to call that? Good. We're around, so very happy to discuss any of this stuff with any of you at any time. We're out this evening. I'm sure we'll be far too busy enjoying yourselves, but be very pleased to have a chat with anyone. As I say, it was an absolute honour and a pleasure to come and talk to this particular group, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Hopefully we'll carry on the conversation. Thank you.